It takes a lot to stop me in my tracks when it comes to new painting gear.
A paint sponge on a stick? Seen it. A digital micro camera mounted to your paintbrush? Tested. Fidget popper palette? Lives on my desk now.
But then a fan sent me this, a needlepoint brush.
This weird-looking brush comes with a gigantic sable belly combined with a long, thin synthetic tip designed for razor-sharp detail.
And honestly, it just looks kind of weird.
But the more I looked into it, the more I wondered if this could help with one of the most annoying, difficult steps in miniature painting: lining or recess shading. This skill requires the lines to be razor-sharp, thin, and incredibly precise. And since it usually comes at the end of your painting process, messing it up can feel catastrophic.
So if there's a brush that makes that step easier, I want to know about it. So I tried it, and I have thoughts, including the one thing this paintbrush absolutely crushes and how you can use it in your miniature painting. Before we get started, let me know in the comments, have you ever seen a brush like this before, or is it just as new to you as it is to me?
So what the heck is this? This is a needlepoint brush, a strange little tool that combines the generous paint-holding belly of a round brush with the long, precise tip of a rigger brush. But really, it looks like a round brush with a bowl cut. So let's break it down.
There are two main features that make or break a good brush:
the belly and the tip. The belly is the thick midsection of the brush that holds your paint. A bigger belly means better flow, fewer interruptions, and less time reloading. Then there's the tip, that fine, pointed end that lets us paint in tiny details. It's what helps us dot eyes, highlight fur texture, or scratch in battle damage. This needlepoint brush takes both of those features to the extreme. I ordered these brushes from Golden Maple, and they were $30 for a set of 4. They arrived within a week, and the packaging looked quite nice. So let's unbox them. Right away, I noticed a clear difference between the sable and synthetic section of the brush. The synthetic tip had a bit of a crusty coating on it, almost like it was sealed with something, which had to be cracked open to allow me to actually feel the consistency of the hairs within the brush. And even after breaking into the candy coating of this brush, I found that the bristles were still quite hard and stiff. Now, this kind of stiffness isn't totally unusual for synthetic brushes, but it was a little odd sitting right next to the ultra-soft sable belly. I tend to burn through synthetic brushes pretty quickly. After prolonged use, synthetic brushes tend to curve at the tip. It's just what happens.
Though I'm not entirely sure why I go through synthetic brushes so quickly. So I'm holding out hope that there is a reason the belly of this brush is sable and the tip is synthetic, and maybe it will last me longer than my usual synthetic brush.
Let's put this brush test on hold for just a second because this deserves a spotlight. If you love tactical combat, strategy games, or anything Warhammer 40,000, you need to check out Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, the sponsor of this video. I'm not much of a gamer, but when I'm waiting for paint to dry or my airbrush to kick on, I love staying in the Warhammer zone by playing Tacticus. The game features over 80 legendary champions across 18 playable factions, though I'm partial to Varro Tigurius and his Storm of Wrath ability. I usually stick to the Indomitus campaign, but there are tons of other modes. PvP, co-op raids, guild battles, you can play your way. And this August, to celebrate the game's 3rd birthday, they're launching their newest faction, the Emperor's Children. Join the fight today by downloading Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Download link in the description box. Use promo code JulyHello to get 50 black stones and 20 energy when you join. Now, back to the brush test because things are about to get weird. Let's talk about our testing. First, I'm testing some basic techniques, layering and glazing. Spoiler, this might not be where the brush performs best. Second, I'll try lighting/recess shading, where precision and paint flow really matter. This is where I expect the brush to shine. Last, we'll try small freehand to see how steady and smooth those tiny strokes feel. I'm hopeful that the brush will crush this type of brushwork as well.
But before I even touch the model, this brush is already a challenge.
I loaded up my wet palette and rolled the brush through the paint like I always do. Tried applying it to the model and nothing. The paint just wouldn't come off the brush. After some trial and error, I figured out a few things. First, you need more paint on your palette than usual. A lot more. Enough to fully roll that massive belly through the paint puddle and saturate the brush thoroughly. This brush belly is way bigger than a standard Winsor Newton. It needs to drink. Unlike a typical round brush, you're actually more likely to underload it than overload it. If the brush isn't fully saturated, the paint just doesn't go anywhere. Second, it helps to thin your paint just a little more than normal. Again, this thinner consistency better saturates the brush and helps the paint flow out of that massive belly.
Okay, so not a huge learning curve so far, but something to get used to.
Let's try layering. I started by painting the quillions of the sword and sigils across the armor in a vibrant yellow, a strong base for the rich magenta gold I have planned. But almost immediately, I noticed something unexpected. It doesn't lay down thin, controlled layers of paint like I'm used to, instead releasing far more paint, leaving large dollops of paint where I press my brush to the model. For something like sigils, this isn't a huge deal, as I can then use my brush to direct the paint in the shape that I want. But for controlled layering, it's annoying, as it's harder to place the paint exactly where I want it. This brush is also pretty particular about direction. You really need to place the brush down and pull back towards the handle. That's where the brush is happiest. Side to side, not so much. Curves, not at all. The tip just resists these movements. It's rather stiff and literally won't bend in a side-to-side motion. If you do want to go to the side, I found it worked better to use a kind of stippling or dabbing motion. Imagine it more like a typewriter moving across the area, not a single smooth pass of the brush. For this reason, glazing is also pretty difficult. Normally, as you pull your brush across the paint surface, the paint naturally tapers, becoming less opaque where the brush touches down and more opaque at the point you lift the brush off the model. But with this brush, the paint stays consistent across the entire stroke. That can be really useful in some situations, but for glazing, not so much.
All that said, getting into tight spots, this brush shines. The fine and narrow tip allows me to get paint into tight spaces without dragging paint where I don't want it.
So not ideal for layering and definitely not good for glazing, but an interesting consolation prize. The next test, lining.
Where I really think this brush is going to do well.
First, let's start by testing this on my hand. I'm starting with my normal round brush so we can see where our baseline is. While I can get a good line, I do have to pick up and replace the brush on my hand. For miniatures though, the amount of line I can get is absolutely enough. Let's look at the needle brush. The line is sharp, smooth, and impressive. These long lines is clearly what this brush was made for. So let's try it on the model. Using just the very tip of the brush and a light touch. I'm carefully painting along the sharp edges of each element to help define the shapes and make everything more readable. Lining is all about placing those tiny shadows that separate shapes and give the model that crisp, three-dimensional look. It's subtle, but it makes a huge difference. As I'm working, I'm noticing that in some areas, the flow and precision are totally flawless. Something like painting a perfectly straight line, which would normally take a ton of focus, comes surprisingly natural with this brush. Again, the ability to reach into tiny crevices also makes this brush amazing. Spots that would usually be a nightmare to paint, like the in-between crevices on the top of this back piece, are suddenly super easy with this brush. However, not everything is going smoothly. As I mentioned earlier, this brush does not like to curve. Trying to follow the contours around the fleur-de-lis, for example, a struggle. The tip just doesn't want to bend in that direction, and the paint suddenly pulls off when I try to move the brush from side to side. I also found that because the paint needs to be thinned more than usual to flow properly, it can sometimes bleed into textured areas, like the front of this corset, if you're not careful. Of course, this could still be user error. I'll admit I'm not exactly a needle brush master, although I have been doing a decent amount of practice before this video.
But since this is where I expected the brush to do its best, let's do a direct comparison with my typical Winsor Newton.
I'm loading my round brush as usual and applying it to the tiny recesses of the model. While the paint does mostly go where I want it, I can't help but notice that I'm hitting a lot of the side elements of what I'm painting. The belly keeps knocking into things along the way. It's interesting how I never noticed that as a problem before I saw how thin the needlepoint brush line could be. That's not to say it is impossible to get such amazing precise lines with a round brush, just that it was easier with the needlepoint brush. So the fine tip isn't as good, but what about loading? While I do have to reload more often compared to the needlepoint brush, I realized something surprising. I actually don't have to reload my round brush as often as I thought. The fresher the paint, the easier it flows, but even as it starts to dry out, I can still get more coverage than I expected. I can almost paint the same area on a single brush load as I would with the needle brush. That said, the longer I go between refills, the harder and more tedious it becomes. So yes, you can push it, but you'll have a better time if you reload often.
Before I give my thoughts, I want to do one more test. Freehand. Painting tiny letters, like ones on a purity seal, are always a nightmare. So if there is any chance that this brush makes this step easier, it's worth investigating.
I'm starting by attempting my usual approach, a mix of squiggles, dots, and lines that kind of looks like writing from a distance. Not only did the needlepoint brush totally flop, it went spectacularly poorly. Trying to paint lines and micro dots at that scale just isn't in this brush's wheelhouse.
Honestly, I was feeling pretty disappointed. The tip is just so long and rigid, it doesn't have the flexibility that we need to do the tiny dots and strokes on miniatures. But that's when a light bulb popped on. Before I give my final thoughts, I want to try one experiment with this brush. So I got a pair of scissors,
Cut down the tip into a fine point, and it didn't really seem to help. Maybe if someone could have given it a proper chop, it would have been better, but with my cutting skills, the brush was even more difficult to work with than before.
So after all these tests, layering, glazing, lining, freehand, where does that leave us?
In theory, this brush should be everything we need for miniature painting, but in practice, it just isn't. It says it's built for detail work, but not our kind of detail. The tip is just too long and too rigid. It doesn't curve the way we need it to, leading to paint blobbing off the brush in dollops and the inability to take tight curves that are standard in miniature painting. However, that doesn't mean it's useless. If you need to line tanks, mechs, or anything with long straight lines,
this brush is your new best friend. That said, if there were a needlepoint brush made in the dimensions of a Winsor Newton, same big belly but just a shorter, more flexible tip, then I think that this sort of brush would be amazing for the kind of work that we do. Before ending this video, I have to remind you that if you like what I do, please subscribe, like, comment. It means so much to me to hear from you. If you really like what I do, you can support me on Patreon, where you can get access to behind-the-scenes content, exclusive videos, and more. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Don't forget to check out Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, link in my description box. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.